All right, let's dive into this, huh? Substance-induced mood disorders. You're going deep, folks. Lots of research here about how substances can really mess with your mood.
Yeah, it's actually way more common than people think.
I bet a lot of people, they're feeling down or anxious and they just think, oh, it's just a bad day or my depression is acting up.
Right, exactly. But they don't realize sometimes what's really going on is that it's the stuff they're taking, the substances that are actually the problem, the root cause.
And we're not just talking about, like, illegal drugs or anything. This is about anything that has a psychoactive effect. I mean, even your morning coffee.
Exactly. And it's not, you don't even have to be addicted. Sometimes just using it once or even going through withdrawal, that can really trigger some serious mood changes.
Okay, so let's get into the details. Our sources are saying that to be diagnosed with a substance-induced mood disorder, the mood problems can't have existed before you started using the substance. So this isn't just someone with, like, pre-existing depression who feels worse after a few drinks.
No, not at all. It has to be like a direct result, right? Like the substance has to be the one that's affecting your brain and body. And the DSM, the diagnostic manual, is very clear about that. The mood changes also have to be pretty severe.
Okay, so we're not talking about just feeling a little bummed after a night out.
No, it's more than that. We're talking like really extreme sadness or anxiety, irritability, sometimes even mania.
Wow.
The kind of stuff that really interferes with your daily life.
Yeah, okay, so this is serious business. And to really understand it, we need to look at, I guess, all the different ways that people interact with these psychoactive substances.
Absolutely. Our sources break it down into like 4 levels: substance use, intoxication, abuse, and then dependence.
Okay, so substance use, I'm guessing that's the most basic level.
Yeah, pretty much. Just means you're using the substance. Doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, just the act of consuming it.
Okay, and then intoxication.
Right. Intoxication is when the substance really starts to like affect your brain and your body. That's when you might experience the feeling of being high or drunk. Your behavior starts to change, your judgment.
Right, you're not thinking straight.
Right. And you might have physical symptoms too: slurred speech, stumbling.
Right, so that's the direct effects of the substance.
Yeah.
Then we have abuse, which is where things start to get, I guess, more problematic.
Yeah. Abuse is when that substance use is starting to cause problems in your life. Relationships, trouble at work or school.
Legal trouble.
Yeah, even legal problems. It's when it starts to negatively impact, your well-being.
And then finally there's substance dependence.
Yeah.
I guess most people would just call that addiction.
Right. Dependence is when you feel like you just can't function without the substance. You might need more and more to get the same effect. And then, of course, you get those awful withdrawal symptoms when you try to quit. At this point, the substance is really controlling your life.
Okay, so those are the 4 levels of involvement. But now we got to look at the specific types of substances because they're not all created equal, are they?
No, they're definitely not. Our sources group them into 4 main categories: depressants, stimulants, opioids, and hallucinogens. Each category affects your brain and body differently, so they can cause different types of mood problems.
So let's start with the depressants. I'm guessing alcohol is the most common.
It is, and alcohol might make you feel good at first, all happy and relaxed, but at the end of the day, it is a depressant. It's slowing down your brain activity, your central nervous system.
So even though people might drink to party and be social, it's actually pushing their brain in the opposite direction.
Exactly. And over time, that can lead to some serious mood problems. Chronic alcohol abuse can actually cause depression that's really hard to distinguish from, like regular depression, major depressive disorder.
So someone who's struggling with alcohol, they might just think they're depressed, but it could actually be the alcohol itself causing those feelings.
It's very possible. And then to make things even more complicated, alcohol also lowers your inhibitions, makes you more impulsive.
So you're more likely to do things you wouldn't normally do and then feel guilty or ashamed later.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. And then we can't forget about withdrawal.
Right.
Alcohol withdrawal can be really rough. Anxiety, tremors, even seizures. It's enough to make anyone feel terrible.
So alcohol can really mess with your mood in a lot of different ways, both during use and during withdrawal. What about other depressants, like prescription medications, Valium, Xanax, things like that?
Those are classified as sedative, hypnotic, or anxiolytic substances.
Okay.
And they can definitely cause mood problems, too.
And I'm guessing the symptoms are pretty similar to alcohol?
They are. They also slow down brain activity, and the intoxication and withdrawal symptoms can be very similar to alcohol. And they can linger, sometimes for a long time.
So even if you're taking those medications as prescribed, there's still a risk of mood-related side effects.
That's right. It's definitely something to be aware of. If you're experiencing mood changes while taking these medications, talk to your doctor.
Okay, so we've covered the downers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about the uppers, the stimulants?
Stimulants do the opposite of depressants. They speed up your brain activity, your central nervous system. That's why you get that increased energy, alertness, focus.
Right, but like depressants, they can also really mess with your mood.
Oh, absolutely.
So where should we start? What about amphetamines? Those are pretty powerful, right?
They are. Amphetamines, like methamphetamine, ecstasy, they initially produce feelings of euphoria, tons of energy. You feel like you can do anything. But like most things in life, there's a downside.
The great crash.
Exactly. That crash can be brutal. You're drained, depressed, and often craving more of the drug to get back to that high.
It's a cycle, chasing that high and then dealing with the low. No wonder it can lead to mood disorders. And what about long-term use? Does that increase the risk even more?
Definitely. Long-term amphetamine use can really damage your brain. Problems with memory, concentration,
Jeez.
even psychosis.
That's scary. So someone who seems to have, like, bipolar disorder, they're swinging between these manic highs and depressive lows. Could that actually be because of amphetamine use and withdrawal?
It's a possibility, which is why it's so important to get a good history when you're evaluating someone for a mood disorder. You have to understand their substance use to get the full picture.
All right, so let's move on to the world's most popular stimulant.
Oh, you mean?
Caffeine. I know. It's not as dramatic as meth, but it's still a psychoactive substance, and it can affect our mood, right?
Absolutely. While caffeine is generally considered safe, it can definitely trigger anxiety, even worsen panic attacks, in people who are already prone to them.
And I'm guessing most of us have experienced the not-so-fun side of caffeine in the form of withdrawal.
Oh, yeah. That afternoon headache when you skip your usual coffee, that's classic caffeine withdrawal. And some people get hit harder with fatigue, irritability, can't concentrate.
Yeah, I feel that. So even our daily coffee fix can mess with our mood in subtle ways. All right, let's move on to another powerful stimulant. Cocaine. How does that one affect our brains and our mood?
Cocaine is tricky. It floods your brain with dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward, so you get that initial rush of euphoria, feeling confident. But that feeling is fleeting, and the crash that follows can be intense.
Yes, you end up chasing that high, which just gets harder and harder to achieve as your tolerance builds.
Exactly. And that chase can lead to some serious mood problems. People who use cocaine regularly, they often end up with anxiety, paranoia, intense cravings. And over the long term, chronic cocaine use can damage the brain's reward pathways, making it hard to experience pleasure from anything.
So it's not just the immediate effects of the drug, it's the long-term changes in the brain that can really set the stage for mood disorders. What about nicotine? I mean, we all know it's addictive, but does smoking actually cause mood problems?
That's a tough one. There's definitely a strong link between nicotine dependence and depression. But it's a bit of a chicken or the egg thing. It's hard to know which comes first.
So are people smoking because they're depressed, or does smoking make them depressed?
Could be either, or both. Some people might start smoking to self-medicate for their depression, while others might actually develop depression because of the physiological effects of the nicotine or just the stress of the addiction itself.
And I'm guessing quitting smoking, which is already incredibly hard, can also trigger mood problems.
Oh, absolutely. Nicotine withdrawal comes with a whole bunch of symptoms. Irritability, anxiety, and, depression. It's like your brain is rebelling against not having that substance it's become so dependent on.
Wow, so we've covered depressants and stimulants, and it seems like they can both cause mood problems just in different ways.
Yeah, for sure.
What's next on our list?
Opioids.
All right, so we're talking heroin, prescription painkillers,
Yeah.
oxycodone, fentanyl, all those, some of the most addictive substances out there.
They are. Opioids work by binding to opioid receptors in your brain, which are involved in, pain relief and pleasure. So when you take an opioid, you get this rush of euphoria, the sense of well-being. Your pain vanishes, your worries fade away.
Sounds nice, but there's a catch, right?
Always a catch. Opioids are highly addictive, and the withdrawal. Oh man, the withdrawal is brutal. We're talking intense cravings, agitation, muscle aches, nausea, vomiting, even diarrhea.
No wonder it's so hard to quit. Your body is practically screaming for the drug. And in the long term, opioid addiction, that can lead to a whole bunch of other problems too, right?
Absolutely. Damage to your organs, weakened immune system, increased risk of overdose, death. And because opioids affect your brain's reward system, they can cause long-term mood problems too, even after you've stopped using them.
So even if you manage to get clean, you might still be dealing with the psychological and emotional fallout of opioid addiction.
Yeah, recovery is a long and complex process. It's really important to have the right support and resources.
Okay, so we've covered depressants, stimulants, and opioids. And it seems like they all have their own unique way of messing with our moods. What's left?
Hallucinogens.
All right, so now we're talking LSD, magic mushrooms, PCP. These are the ones that can really distort your perception of reality.
Exactly. Hallucinogens disrupt the communication between different parts of your brain, leading to altered states of consciousness, and all sorts of sensory experiences.
And I'm guessing that can have a pretty big impact on your mood.
Oh, definitely. The emotional effects of hallucinogens can vary a lot. Some people experience euphoria, mystical experiences, while others get hit with anxiety, paranoia, even terror.
It's like a roller coaster for your emotions.
It can be, and the experience can depend on a lot of things. The drug, the dose, your surroundings, and even your own mindset going into it.
So some people might have a profound, spiritual experience, while others might end up in the emergency room having a bad trip.
Exactly. And even within the same trip, you can experience this whole range of emotions, from joy and laughter to fear and despair. It can be pretty unpredictable.
Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, marijuana. It's becoming increasingly legal and accessible, and a lot of people view it as a pretty harmless drug. But what does the research say about marijuana's impact on mood?
Marijuana is complex. Its effects on mood can vary quite a bit. Some people will experience relaxation, euphoria, while others feel anxious or paranoid.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Not at all. And the effects can also depend on the specific strain of marijuana you're using. Some strains are higher in THC, which is the psychoactive component that gets you high. Others are higher in CBD, which is thought to have more therapeutic effects.
So even if two people are smoking marijuana, they could be having completely different experiences.
That's right. And it's important to remember that even though marijuana is becoming more mainstream, it can still have negative consequences.
Like what? What kind of consequences?
Well, for some people, marijuana use can lead to problems with memory, concentration, motivation. It can also worsen existing mental health conditions like anxiety and depression.
And of course, there's the risk of addiction.
Absolutely. While marijuana isn't as physically addictive as some other drugs, it can still be psychologically addictive. You feel that strong urge to use it, even when it's causing problems.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the different types of substances, how they affect our brains and bodies, and the different ways they can impact our mood.
Right.
And we've learned that substance-induced mood disorders, they're real, they can be serious, and they often go unrecognized.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not done yet. In part 2, we're going to dive into the long-term consequences of substance use and explore what recovery actually looks like.
It'll be interesting.
So stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive. We're continuing our exploration of substance-induced mood disorders.
Yep. Picking up where we left off, we've already talked about the different types of substances and how they can mess with your mood both in the short term and over the long haul.
Right, we've talked about those different levels of involvement, from just using something to full-blown dependence, and how each category, the depressants, stimulants, all of them, they can trigger these different mood problems. And it's not always obvious, right? Sometimes what looks like just regular depression or anxiety could actually be caused by substance use or withdrawal.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important for people to be aware of the connection between substances and their mood. And if you're struggling, don't hesitate to reach out and get professional help.
Couldn't agree more. But today we're going even deeper. We're going to look at those long-term consequences of substance use.
Yeah.
Beyond those immediate mood swings and the withdrawal symptoms.
Because the truth is, chronic substance use, it can leave lasting scars, physically and mentally.
Yeah. So let's start with the physical impact. We know that using substances can damage all sorts of organs, but how does it actually affect the brain?
Well, our brains are incredibly complex. They rely on this delicate balance of chemicals and pathways to function properly, and substances just throw that balance way off. And over time, that disruption can lead to some pretty serious problems.
Like what? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Take alcohol, for instance. We all know heavy drinking can damage the liver, but it also really messes with your brain.
In what way? How so?
Well, it can actually shrink your brain, lead to a loss of brain cells. It can damage the frontal lobe, which is, the part of your brain responsible for making decisions, controlling your impulses, planning ahead.
So if you've been drinking heavily for a long time, you might have trouble thinking clearly, making good choices, controlling your behavior.
Exactly. You might be more impulsive, more irritable, and have a harder time learning new things.
What about memory? Does alcohol affect that too?
It can, especially long-term heavy drinking. Alcohol can interfere with your brain's ability to make new memories, even retrieve old ones.
So you might forget things that happened recently, or even events from further back.
Yeah, exactly. And in some really severe cases, long-term alcohol abuse can lead to a condition called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, which is basically permanent brain damage with these really severe memory problems.
Man, that's scary. It sounds like alcohol can really do a number on your brain.
Yeah,
What about other substances? Do they have similar effects?
they do. Different substances target different areas of the brain. They work in different ways, but the basic idea is the same. Chronic use, it throws off the balance in your brain, and that can lead to long-term damage.
Okay, let's talk about amphetamines again. We know they can trigger psychosis in the short term, but what about the long-term effects on the brain?
Well, amphetamines, especially meth, can really damage the dopamine system, and that's the system involved in, feeling rewarded, feeling motivated, and even your movement.
Dopamine, that's the feel-good chemical, right? The one that gets released when we do something pleasurable.
That's the one. And when you're flooding your brain with dopamine artificially, like you do with amphetamines, it actually damages those dopamine receptors. So it becomes harder to experience pleasure naturally.
So the things that used to make you happy, they just don't have the same effect anymore.
Right. And long-term, amphetamine abuse can cause problems with movement, coordination, even symptoms that look a lot like Parkinson's disease.
So we've seen how alcohol and amphetamines can damage the brain. What about other substances like opioids and hallucinogens? Do those have similar long-term effects?
They do. Opioids, for example, they can cause all sorts of cognitive problems, memory loss, even brain damage from, not getting enough oxygen if someone overdoses. Hallucinogens, those can trigger some lasting psychological problems too, like flashbacks and these weird perceptual disturbances.
It's kind of like playing Russian roulette with your brain. You might get lucky, or you might end up with some serious damage that changes your life.
That's a good way to put it. And the problem is, a lot of times we don't know how substances are going to affect us individually until it's too late.
Yeah, so not worth the risk. But let's shift gears a little bit here. Let's talk about the psychological and emotional fallout from substance use. So we know substance use can cause mood disorders, but can those mood problems stick around even after someone gets sober?
They can. Sometimes the mood problems are directly caused by the substance, so they clear up when the substance is out of your system. But sometimes substance use can trigger or make worse some underlying mental health condition, and those need more attention, more treatment.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's say someone who's already prone to anxiety, maybe they have a family history of it, they start using cocaine to help them in social situations.
Right.
So at first the cocaine seems to help, it relieves their anxiety, but over time, it actually makes the anxiety worse.
So even though they're using the drug to feel better, it's actually backfiring, creating a bigger problem down the road.
Exactly. And even after they quit the cocaine, they might still be dealing with that anxiety disorder. And it could be even more severe than it was before.
Wow. So quitting the substance isn't always a magic cure. You might still have to deal with the emotional and psychological damage that's been done.
Mm-hmm. Recovery is a process. It takes time. And it often involves dealing with those underlying mental health issues that might have contributed to the substance use in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. So where do we go from here? We've talked about this dark side of substance use, the long-term consequences, the damage it can do. But what about the flip side? What about hope? What about healing?
Well, that's where things get interesting, right? Because even though substance use can have these devastating consequences, recovery is always possible.
That's good to hear. But what does recovery actually look like? I mean, what are the key ingredients?
Well, there's no one answer to that. Recovery is different for everyone. But our sources, they highlight a few key factors that seem to show up in most successful recoveries.
I am listening. Tell me more. What are those factors?
One of the big ones is social support. Having people who love and support you, that can make all the difference.
So family, friends, support groups, all that.
Yep. Those people can offer encouragement, keep you accountable and give you a sense of belonging. And that's so important when you're trying to stay sober and build a new life.
It's like having a cheering section, a team of people who are there for you, rooting for you every step of the way.
I like that. That's a great analogy. And just like any good team, you need a good coach. And that's where professional help comes in.
So finding a therapist or a counselor who specializes in addiction.
Yeah. A qualified professional, they can provide guidance, support, and, proven treatments that can help you deal with the underlying causes of your addiction, help you develop those healthy coping mechanisms.
So it's not just about willpower, like white-knuckling it through those cravings.
Mm.
It's about understanding what's driving the problem in the first place and learning new ways to manage those challenges.
Exactly. And therapy can also help you work through any trauma, grief, or other emotional issues that might be playing a role in your substance use.
Because let's face it, a lot of times addiction is a way of coping with pain, with difficult emotions.
It is. And until you learn healthier ways to cope, you're going to be more likely to relapse.
So we've got social support, we've got professional help. What else is important for recovery?
You've got to develop those healthy coping mechanisms. That could be anything, exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, being creative.
So finding things you enjoy that help you manage stress in a positive way.
Right. It's about replacing those bad coping mechanisms, like using substances, with healthy ones. Things that nourish your mind, your body, your spirit.
That's where self-care comes in, right?
Absolutely. Taking care of your physical and emotional needs, that's crucial for recovery. Getting enough sleep, eating right, and doing things that bring you peace and joy.
It's like filling up your tank so you have something to draw on when things get tough.
I like that. And remember, self-care isn't selfish. It's self-preservation.
This has been a really insightful conversation. We've explored the dark side of substance use, the long-term consequences, the potential for damage. But we've also seen that there's hope.
There is. Recovery is definitely possible. It's not easy. But with the right support, the right treatment, and that commitment to self-care, people can overcome these challenges. And they do.
And we're not done yet. In part 3, we're going to get into some of the cutting-edge research on substance use. We'll talk about the new treatments, the whole evolving landscape.
It's pretty exciting stuff.
So stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive on substance-induced mood disorders. We've covered so much ground already, exploring the different types of substances, how they affect us, that long road to recovery.
We've seen just how much damage substance use can do to your mood, your health, your life. But we've also seen that recovery is possible. There's always hope.
Absolutely. And today, we're going to shift gears a bit. We're going to look ahead to the future. We'll explore some of that cutting-edge research that's changing how we understand and treat these disorders.
This is where things get really interesting. Scientists are making incredible breakthroughs. We're starting to see a real shift in how we approach addiction, and mental health in general.
One area I'm really fascinated by is the research on genetics. Like, is there a predisposition to addiction? Are some people just wired differently, making them more vulnerable to these disorders?
Yeah, that's a question that's been around forever, right? And thanks to all the advances in genetic research, we're finally getting some answers.
So what have they found? What are the scientists saying?
Well, it's not like there's one single addiction gene or anything like that. But researchers have found certain gene variations that seem to increase your risk of developing a substance use disorder.
Okay, so if you have these variations, does that mean you're, like, doomed? Destined to become addicted?
No, not at all. Genes aren't destiny. It's not that simple. They might increase your vulnerability, but they don't determine your outcome. Think of it like this. Having a genetic predisposition is kind of like having a loaded gun in your house.
Well,
It doesn't mean you're going to shoot it, but it does increase the risk of an accident.
that's a pretty powerful analogy.
Yeah.
So what does determine whether that gun goes off? If it's not just our genes, what else is at play?
Well, your environment plays a huge role. All sorts of things. Childhood trauma, if you were exposed to substances at a young age, social pressures, stress, all of those can influence whether someone with a genetic predisposition will actually develop a substance use disorder.
So even if you're born with a higher risk,
Yeah,
if you have a supportive environment and you learn those healthy coping skills, you can still be okay.
exactly. It's really a combination of nature and nurture, right? Both are important.
Yeah, this research is really helping us understand how complicated addiction is. It's helping us move away from that old just say no kind of thinking.
For sure, addiction is a complex brain disease. And like any disease, it needs a multifaceted approach to treatment, right? It's not just one thing.
Well, speaking of treatment, what are some of the new trends in the field? What are some of those new and innovative approaches that are giving people hope?
One exciting area is the development of new medications. These are medications that actually target the brain pathways involved in addiction.
So instead of just treating the withdrawal symptoms or trying to reduce cravings, these medications actually address the root cause, like the neurological mechanisms behind addiction.
Yep, that's the idea. And some of these medications are really showing promise in clinical trials. For example, there are medications that can block the pleasurable effects of opioids, so they're less appealing to someone who's struggling.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like taking away the reward that's driving the behavior. What other new things are out there?
Another area that's getting a lot of attention is non-invasive brain stimulation.
I've heard about that. It sounds pretty futuristic. What is it exactly?
There are a couple of different techniques, but basically they use magnetic or electrical pulses to stimulate certain areas of the brain, the areas involved in addiction.
So you're basically trying to rewire the brain's circuitry.
Kind of, yeah.
Hmm.
The goal is to normalize the brain activity in those areas that have been sort of hijacked by the addiction.
And is it working? I mean, does it actually help?
Well, the research is still early, but there are some promising results. For example, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, it's showing some success in reducing cravings and improving mood.
It's really amazing to think we might be able to treat addiction by actually targeting the specific brain circuits involved. What other exciting things are happening in the treatment world?
One trend that's really picking up steam is harm reduction.
Yeah, I've heard that term a lot lately. Can you explain what it means?
Sure, harm reduction is a philosophy that's all about reducing the negative consequences of substance use, even if someone isn't ready to completely quit.
So instead of just pushing for abstinence, we're acknowledging that people are going to use substances no matter what, and we're trying to make it as safe as possible for them.
Exactly. It's a more realistic approach, and more compassionate, too.
Can you give us some examples? Like, what does harm reduction actually look like?
Sure. One classic example is needle exchange programs, where people who inject drugs can get clean needles. The goal there is to reduce the spread of HIV and hepatitis C.
Right. And there are those safe injection sites where people can use drugs under medical supervision. So if they overdose, someone's there to help.
Right. But harm reduction is more than just those interventions. It also includes educating people about the risks of different substances, encouraging people to use in moderation if they're going to use, and providing support services to those who are struggling.
So it's about meeting people where they're at,
Yeah.
offering them support without judging them.
Exactly. And research shows that harm reduction strategies can be really effective in reducing overdoses, HIV and hepatitis C transmission, and all sorts of other harms.
It sounds like this whole field of substance use treatment is really changing.
It is. We're moving away from the old stigma and punishment-based models and embracing these more evidence-based and humane approaches. It's a good thing.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important message is that substance-induced mood disorders are real. They can be very serious, but they are treatable.
And there's always hope for recovery, no matter how tough things might seem.
Absolutely. With the right support, the right treatment, and a commitment to self-care, people can overcome these challenges. And they do.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've learned so much about how substances and mood are connected, the dangers of addiction, and all the incredible advances in research and treatment.
We've definitely seen the dark side.
Yeah.
But there's light at the end of the tunnel, too.
And for anyone out there who's listening, if you're struggling, please know that you're not alone.
Reach out. Get help. There are people who care, and there are resources available to support you on your journey.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into